The waiting room was quiet in a way that made every movement feel like a disruption. I remember adjusting my coat 3 times, crossing and uncrossing my legs, glancing at the abstract art on the wall that seemed to vibrate under the weight of my own unease. When the door finally opened, I stood too quickly, heart lurching in anticipation or fear. I still can't tell which. She appeared in the doorway, wearing a dark blouse and slacks, her hair tied loosely at the nape. Her presence didn't comfort me, not in the usual sense. It unsettled something buried and long dormant. Her office was warmer than I expected. Not just the temperature, but the atmosphere. Low lighting, deep amber tones, books arranged not alphabetically but organically. There was a candle burning on the side table, the scent faint but sharp, maybe sandalwood or something more herbal. The couch was leather, old enough to creak but soft enough to cradle. I sat on the far edge, my knees pressed together, palms flat on my thighs. She took the chair across from me, crossed one leg over the other, and opened a small notebook on her lap. I began talking almost immediately, filling the space with words I hadn't planned to share. Childhood fragments, vague descriptions of anxiety, confessions softened by laughter. She listened without interrupting, her pen still, her eyes fixed on mine in a way that made me feel both seen and completely bare. Her gaze wasn't clinical. It didn't catalog symptoms or tally patterns. It felt like she was studying me, but not for healing, for something more intimate, more pointed. I started to feel like the subject of a painting rather than a patient. I noticed the minute hand crawl past the hour mark, but said nothing. I should have left. I should have reminded her the session was over. Instead, I stayed. I spoke slower, deliberately now, testing the temperature of the room, of her attention. She shifted in her chair, leaning slightly forward, and my breath caught when her blouse loosened at the collar. I wasn't supposed to notice that. I wasn't supposed to notice the way her lips curved at the corners when I hesitated, and yet I did. Her questions weren't inappropriate, not in a way that could be quoted or filed, but they were layered. They went beyond context and cut into instinct. She asked about my dreams, my physical reactions to fear, how I felt when I woke up alone. Her tone never changed, always calm, always even, but something in her voice hummed beneath the words, a subtle invitation laced into the structure of inquiry. I answered everything, not because I trusted her, but because I wanted her to keep asking. At some point, I began watching her more closely than I should have. The line of her throat when she sipped from her glass, the way her fingers tapped the edge of her notebook without writing anything down. She wasn't distant. If anything, she was too present. It felt like being studied and desired at the same time, though I couldn't be sure of either. The room pulsed with something unspeakable. It was like the space between us had become dense, magnetic. By the time I stood to leave, my legs were slightly unsteady. I felt altered, not just emotionally, but physically, as if the session had left a mark on my body. Pressure behind the eyes, heat along the spine, a vague ache between my thighs I refused to name. She walked me to the door, her hand briefly touching the frame as I passed. That touch didn't land on my skin, but I felt it anyway. I carried it home like a stone in my pocket, heavy and unexplainable. That night, I undressed slowly. I stood in front of the mirror longer than usual, examining my own reflection, like I was searching for something new, something she might have seen. My body looked the same, but I felt different in it. I lay in bed with the lights off and my fingers resting on my stomach, not moving, just waiting. Her face hovered in the darkness behind my eyelids, not in a flash or fantasy, but in quiet fragments. Her jawline, her eyes, the way her hand turned the page of her notebook without looking. I slipped one hand lower, not with urgency, but with ritual. I was remembering more than imagining. I didn't think about the ethics. I didn't think about the consequences. I only thought about her voice, the softness of it, and the way it wrapped around me like silk. The session had gone long, yes, but it hadn't ended when I left the room. It followed me home. It crawled into my sheets. It settled into my chest. And by the time I fell asleep, my body humming with some unspoken admission, I knew I would go back. Not for healing, not for closure, but for her. The second session began with a strange sense of anticipation, like stepping into a room where something unspoken had already happened. I arrived early, waiting in my car until the digital clock blinked 2 minutes past the hour, pretending I was not eager, pretending I wasn't already flushed from the idea of seeing her again. My palms were damp when I reached for the handle of the office door. My breath caught somewhere shallow in my throat. When I entered, she looked up with that same unreadable expression, neutral but not empty, still but not distant. The room looked exactly as I remembered, but everything inside me had shifted. I didn't sit in the same spot as last time. I sat closer. She didn't comment on my position, nor did she open her notebook. Her eyes met mine and stayed there for a moment too long, long enough for my skin to register the attention like heat. I told myself I was imagining it, that the quick beat of my heart was simply nervousness, not recognition, but I knew better. There was an energy between us now, a presence in the pauses, in the way our bodies occupied space. I could feel her watching not just what I said, but how I said it, what words I hesitated over, what parts of my body shifted when the topic grew too tender. It wasn't about analysis anymore. It felt like witnessing. The questions she asked this time weren't just about trauma or memory. They reached into subtler territory. My comfort with touch, my relationship to control, how I experienced silence in the company of others. Each inquiry felt like a slow hand pressing against my ribs, not enough to hurt, but just enough to be felt long after the pressure was gone. I answered more carefully now, not because I didn't want her to know, but because I wasn't sure if the truth belonged to me anymore or had started becoming hers. I noticed her eyes dropping occasionally, to my hands, to my knees, to the spot where my blouse parted slightly when I leaned forward. I became hyper-aware of my body, the way I crossed my legs, the angle of my neck, how I lifted my hand to brush hair from my face. Every movement felt exaggerated under her gaze, like I was performing something I hadn't rehearsed. But instead of discomfort, it stirred something low and aching. My skin felt more alive in that room, like it had been waiting for someone to look at it properly. I wanted her to look. I wanted her to keep looking. At one point, the silence stretched between us long enough that I began to feel exposed, as if she were peeling away something invisible layer by layer. I shifted slightly in my seat and noticed her mirroring the motion a moment later. It wasn't dramatic, it was quiet, but it was real. We were sinking in a way that felt both terrifying and inevitable. It reminded me of the way lovers move without needing language, responding to breath and tension and small contractions of muscle. I couldn't remember what exactly we talked about after that. The words blurred into a kind of hum, a soft droning beneath the louder rhythm of my thoughts. What I do remember is the way she sat, her posture more relaxed than before, one foot tucked beneath her, her hand resting openly on the armrest of her chair, fingers splayed slightly. It was the hand that stayed with me, the stillness of it, the way it suggested patience, invitation, restraint. It made me wonder what those fingers would feel like if they traced the inside of my wrist instead of the air between us. When the session ended, she stood up slowly, as if moving through water. I watched her approach the door, her steps quiet on the rug, her profile lit by the diffused glow of the lamp behind her. I hesitated to follow, not because I didn't want to leave, but because I didn't want to leave her. I walked past her with a careful nod, my shoulder brushing hers just barely, and my body reacted as if I'd been touched fully. That contact, so small, bloomed across my skin like heat from a struck match. Back home, I couldn't settle. I moved from room to room, picking up objects and setting them down again. I ran a bath but didn't get in. I made tea and let it go cold. My body was restless, but it wasn't anxiety. It was desire, not fully formed, but pulsing beneath the surface. I lay on the couch with my knees drawn up, shirt riding high on my thighs, and closed my eyes. I could still smell the room, still hear the pause before her voice would return after I had said something vulnerable, still feel the phantom impression of her eyes on my skin. Eventually, I went to bed but didn't sleep. I replayed her expression in my mind, the curve of her mouth when she was thinking, the way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. I thought of her hands again, of the stillness they held, and I slipped my own between my legs. My breath caught immediately. I wasn't imagining her doing anything, not exactly. I was remembering the way I felt in her presence, opened, studied, seen. That was enough. That was more than enough. As I moved, slowly at first, then with more insistence, I kept my eyes closed and whispered nothing at all. It wasn't about fantasy. It was about response, about what had already been awakened. My body moved with the echo of her questions, the ones that reached too deep, the ones I didn't know how to answer without trembling. When I came, it was soft and warm and slow, like a tide rolling in and never going back out. I lay there afterwards with my hand still resting low against my belly, breath slowing, and I knew something had changed, not in a loud or dramatic way, but in the way I now carried her voice inside me, in the way my body knew her without having been touched. It was the intimacy of pause, of spaces left intentionally blank, of eyes that said too much. I had not been seduced. I had been opened, and I didn't want to close again. The third session began like the others, but something in the room had undeniably shifted. The air felt heavier, not with discomfort, but with the weight of anticipation. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me gently, the familiar scent of sandalwood already working its way into my bloodstream like a drug. She was standing this time, not seated, her body angled toward the bookshelf, fingers brushing along the spines without urgency. When she turned to face me, her eyes didn't scan, they held. It felt less like a greeting and more like recognition, like she already knew what I hadn't yet admitted to myself. She gestured toward the couch, but I didn't move right away. Instead, I watched her as she walked back to her chair, as she sat down slowly, legs crossed, hands resting openly in her lap. I felt a flicker of hesitation, not fear, but something more primal, a sudden awareness that whatever lines once existed between us had grown thin. I sat, this time allowing myself to relax back into the cushions, body angled toward her, knee tilted just slightly in her direction. The position was deliberate. I wanted her to notice, and I think she did. Her questions were softer now, less clinical, more curious. She asked about my physical sensations in moments of vulnerability, about what my body did when I felt exposed. She used words like grounding, somatic, and presence, but beneath them there was something else, something intimate, searching. I felt her voice move through me like touch. I began to answer more slowly, drawing out my words, letting them settle into the space between us. Her nods were slower too, her gaze fixed not only on my eyes, but on my mouth, my collarbone, the way my fingers gripped the hem of my shirt. At one point, she leaned forward and asked if I was comfortable exploring some light somatic work. My throat tightened slightly, but I nodded. She moved from her chair to a low stool she placed beside me. The shift in height was intentional, disarming. Her hands remained in her lap for a moment before she asked if she could place them lightly on my shoulders to guide my breath. Again, I agreed. Again, I felt the familiar tingle of crossing into something I couldn't name. When her hands landed on me, they were warm, steady, controlled. But what I felt went far beyond pressure or weight. It was electric. Her palms rested just above my shoulder blades, and I closed my eyes, not to shut her out, but to feel her more completely. She spoke softly, guiding me through deep breaths, but I couldn't focus on her words. All I could focus on was the subtle movement of her fingers, the way her touch stayed just long enough to linger. Every point of contact felt like an answer to a question I hadn't asked aloud. My chest rose and fell beneath her touch, and when I exhaled, I felt something unravel. A knot, a memory, a boundary. Her hands slowly slid down my arms, not hurried, not intrusive. I knew she was gauging my response, watching for resistance. There was none. Instead, my body leaned into her contact, craving more. I felt her breath near my ear, close but not touching, and it made my skin tighten with awareness. Then she stepped back, just slightly, and told me to take a few moments to feel the residual sensation. I nodded again, eyes still closed, breathing uneven. I heard her move, the subtle shift of weight as she returned to her chair. When I opened my eyes, she was watching me, her expression unreadable but open. The session didn't return to words after that. It didn't need to. Something had already been spoken without sound. I left the office dazed, my limbs heavy, my mind quiet but charged. The street outside felt too bright, too fast. I sat in my car with the engine off, hands resting in my lap where hers had been just moments earlier. I stared at my own fingers, wondering if they could remember the temperature of her skin. I drove home slowly, my thighs pressed together tighter than usual, a pulse alive between them that refused to ease. That night, I didn't bother with distractions. No television, no music. I lit a single candle and let the shadows crawl across the ceiling. My body was alive in a way that made movement unnecessary. I lay in bed fully clothed, but it felt like I was already naked. I could still feel her breath on my skin, her hands on my back, the pressure of her presence echoing down my spine. I undressed slowly, not out of necessity, but ceremony. Each piece of clothing peeled away like an old skin, revealing not just flesh, but truth. I stood in front of the mirror again, my body illuminated in flickering amber. I cupped my own breasts, dragged my hands down over my stomach, across my hips, down between my thighs. My touch was slower than usual, more deliberate. I was no longer imagining her doing something to me. I was responding to what she already had. I didn't chase climax. I surrendered to sensation. I moved with rhythm, not speed. I arched into my own palm and whispered her name once, not because I wanted her to hear it, but because I needed to admit it out loud. My orgasm came like a wave, dragged from the bottom of the ocean, quiet but devastating, slow but total. I cried when it passed, not from sadness, but from the feeling of release so complete it hollowed me out. When I finally fell asleep, my body curled inward, hands resting on my chest. I dreamed of her, not as a therapist, not as a guide, but as something else entirely, something outside of name and role. In the dream, she was neither asking nor taking. She was simply there, inside the space that used to be filled with loneliness. And when I woke the next morning, the sheets tangled between my legs. I knew the boundaries we had pretended to maintain were already gone. Not blurred, not crossed, gone. The days between sessions became unbearable in their silence. I found myself filling them with imagined conversations, replaying moments from our time together like old recordings I couldn't stop looping. Each night, I lay in bed and reconstructed her hands on my shoulders, her breath near my ear, the softness of her tone wrapping itself around the places in me no one else had touched. Even the mundane routines of my day began to feel saturated with her presence. I would pick up my coffee cup and remember how her fingers had brushed mine when she handed me a glass of water. I would walk past a mirror and wonder how she saw me, if she remembered the curve of my body under her hands as clearly as I did. I started dressing differently for our sessions, not provocatively, but with intention. Softer fabrics, deeper necklines, jewelry I hadn't worn in years. I wanted her to notice. I wanted to see the flicker of recognition in her eyes, the subtle dilation of her pupils. I chose my lipstick not for color, but for how it might look smudged. Each preparation became a ritual, a quiet seduction masked to self-care. I would spray perfume behind my ears and on the inside of my wrists, imagining her leaning close enough to inhale it. There were no rules anymore. Not really. I told myself I was still a patient, that this was still a therapeutic relationship, but I no longer believed it. The sessions had turned into something else entirely. The questions she asked skirted too close to hunger. She lingered in doorways. Her eyes moved over me like hands. I noticed her posture when she sat, how her legs remained slightly parted, how her blouse opened just enough to reveal a shadow of skin when she leaned forward. None of it was accidental. Or maybe it was, but I didn't want it to be. One afternoon, I walked past her office on a day we weren't scheduled to meet. I told myself it was a coincidence that I was in the area, but I stood across the street, staring at the window with the half-drawn curtain, hoping for movement. When none came, I felt both relieved and devastated. I realized then that I wasn't waiting for therapy anymore. I was waiting for her. I was waiting for something neither of us could name out loud, but both of us were feeding in secret. At night, my dreams grew more vivid. She was always there, always close, her voice sliding into my sleep like warm water. I would wake with her name on my lips, my thighs damp, my hands already moving before I was fully conscious. I stopped resisting the impulse. It felt less like a fantasy and more like continuation, as if the work we were doing didn't end in her office, as if it lived in my sheets, my breath, my skin. I began sleeping naked. I began sleeping with the window open, as if the night air could carry some part of her to me. There were moments during the week when I could feel her even without stimulus. Standing in the elevator, I would suddenly remember the sound of her exhale. Bending to tie my shoes, I would feel her eyes on the small of my back. These weren't memories. They were hauntings, and I welcomed them. I let them press against me like hands. I stopped seeing other people. I stopped flirting, stopped returning messages. No one else's voice held weight anymore. No one else looked at me the way she did, as though I were both a question and the answer. Even my reflection began to shift. I looked softer, more open, more undone. There was a flush in my cheeks I didn't recognize, a glow that didn't belong to sleep or sunlight. It belonged to her. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I would walk to my mirror and stare at myself in the dark. I would touch the side of my neck, drag my fingers down between my breasts, imagining her watching me. I didn't speak. I didn't moan. I just breathed, slowly, letting the air fill the space where her fingers weren't. It became a ritual, a way to bridge the gap between our meetings. It wasn't enough, but it kept me alive. One morning, I caught myself writing her name in the corner of a notebook page, not fully, not legibly, but in the loop of letters that only meant something to me. It was something a schoolgirl would do, and yet there I was, grown, rational, fully aware, and still reduced to a girl carving desire into paper. I stared at the ink for a long time, heart pounding, the letters trembling as though they had come from somewhere deeper than thought. Between sessions, I avoided making plans. I didn't want distractions. I wanted time to stretch, to ache, to be shaped by longing. My world had narrowed to a single room with dim lighting and a woman whose touch I could feel even in her absence. I didn't care if it was wrong. I didn't care if it was dangerous. It was real. More real than anything else in my life. And the more I fed it, the more it consumed me. I stopped asking questions. I stopped wondering what it meant. I let the pull between us deepen, let the boundaries dissolve further. Whatever she was doing to me, it wasn't therapy. But I didn't want healing anymore. I wanted to be touched again. I wanted her fingers on my skin, her breath on my face, her voice calling me not by name, but by need. And I knew the next time I saw her, I wouldn't wait for permission. I would let the silence between us speak the truth we were too careful to say. The 5th session didn't begin like the others. There was no chair across from me this time. She had moved it closer to the couch, angled slightly inward, intimate by design. I noticed the absence of her notebook before I noticed anything else. It was always there, always present, like a barrier, a shield she held between us. But now it was gone, and in its place was something far more honest. She sat with her legs crossed, one foot bare, the arch resting lightly on the rug, her blouse slightly unbuttoned in a way that didn't seem accidental. I felt stripped the moment I walked into the room, not by force, but by expectation, the kind that didn't need to be spoken aloud. My body responded before my mind could object, settling into the familiar cushions like it already knew the shape of surrender. Her gaze no longer scanned for symptoms. It lingered on skin, on breath, on hesitation. I waited for her to ask a question, something to anchor me, but nothing came. Just silence, soft and thick, a space carefully created to trap every movement, every sigh. Eventually, she stood and moved toward me, her steps unhurried. She sat beside me, close enough that her thigh brushed mine. That single point of contact became everything. My pulse quickened. I could feel it in my neck, in my wrists, between my legs. She reached for a throw blanket and draped it over my lap, a gesture so casual and yet so invasive, I didn't know how to react. I didn't need the warmth. I needed the implication. She began asking things that had nothing to do with memory or cognition. She wanted to know what I felt in my pelvis when I thought about being watched. She asked how my breath changed when someone took control. Her voice was low, close, the words sliding over me like warm oil. I answered with my body more than with my mouth. Shoulders tense, thighs pressed together, hands clenched under the blanket. She noticed everything. She always did. Her hand moved to my knee, resting there, then tapping lightly, rhythmically, like she was testing something beneath the surface. The gesture was so restrained, so measured, and yet I felt it radiating through me. When she leaned in to adjust a pillow behind my back, her chest brushed mine, and I inhaled sharply. She didn't apologize. She never apologized. She simply observed, documented, consumed. At some point, she told me to close my eyes. I obeyed instantly. The room fell away, and I felt her breath near my temple, the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the warm air. I waited for her touch like it was oxygen. And then it came, not to my hand or shoulder, but to my throat. light, barely there. Her fingers hovered over my pulse, not pressing, just acknowledging. My body stilled completely, like prey recognizing the weight of the hunter's gaze. She traced along my collarbone, her fingers moving slowly, deliberately, making sure I felt each inch of contact. My lips parted on instinct. I wasn't thinking anymore. I was responding. I was following. I was becoming whatever she wanted me to be. Her fingers dipped lower, not beneath fabric, not yet, but enough to signal what we both knew would come next. I didn't flinch. I didn't resist. I was hers. The session blurred after that. I remember kneeling. I remember the sound of her breathing, slower than mine, always in control. I remember the feel of her hands guiding my movements, the pressure of her body behind mine, the quiet words she said, not therapeutic, not clinical, but commanding. I responded without needing instruction. My body knew what she wanted. It had been trained, not through repetition, but through hunger, through waiting. Later, I sat on the edge of the couch, legs weak, my blouse wrinkled, my breath still catching in uneven waves. She handed me a glass of water, and I took it with trembling hands. Her fingers brushed mine deliberately. A reminder, a claim. I drank without looking at her, but I felt her gaze on my skin, marking me in ways I couldn't wash off. I didn't want to. When I stood to leave, she stepped behind me and straightened my collar. Her fingers lingered at the nape of my neck longer than necessary. My knees nearly buckled. She opened the door and stepped aside, letting me walk out first. But I didn't feel like I was walking away. I felt like I was being released, temporarily. That night, I didn't shower. I didn't want to lose the texture of her touch. I wanted to lie in my own sweat and silence, let the memory of her fingers burn a little deeper into my skin. I crawled into bed without changing, curled around the ache she had left behind. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just lay there with my legs pulled to my chest, and I breathed through the heat, through the shame, through the thrill. It was no longer a question of whether she had power. She did. It was no longer about ethics or roles or language. It was about what I had given her and how easily she took it. She hadn't asked for permission, and I hadn't offered it. But somewhere between silence and breath, I had handed over everything, and she knew it. The sessions weren't sessions anymore. They were rituals, initiations, and I, without realizing it, had become devout. The sixth session began in silence. I stepped into the room and heard the door click shut behind me, louder than usual, final in a way that made my breath catch. She didn't say hello. She didn't gesture toward the couch. She simply locked the door and turned to face me. The sound of the latch echoed in my chest. I felt it more than I heard it. She moved slowly, deliberately, her heels soundless against the rug. There was something ceremonial in her posture, something stripped of pretense. She no longer wore the soft professionalism of a therapist. That part of her had been folded away. What stood in front of me now was someone else entirely. Not a caretaker, not a guide, a handler, a puppeteer, and I was the string. She circled behind me, her hand brushing the small of my back with the familiarity of ownership. I didn't flinch. I didn't speak. I let her guide me with the lightest touch until I was standing in the middle of the room, exactly where she wanted me. I kept my eyes forward, but I felt her breath near my ear, the temperature of her body, the smell of her skin, her presence draped over me like velvet. Her hands reached around and undid the first button of my blouse, then the second. I didn't move to help. I didn't move at all. My arms hung limp at my sides as she slowly parted the fabric, revealing inch after inch of skin as though unwrapping a gift she had already claimed. When she slid the blouse down my shoulders and let it fall to the floor, I felt the shift in the room, not in temperature, but in tension. The moment had ripened. She moved to my front, eyes lingering on my chest, then down to my stomach, her gaze slow, consuming. I was no longer dressed in implication. I stood in front of her in lace and breath and consent wrapped in silence. She didn't ask for anything, she took. Her hands moved with authority, grazing the tops of my thighs, hooking into the waistband of my skirt, pulling it down slowly until I stepped out of it, trembling. I stood there, bare except for lingerie, and felt the weight of her gaze like fingers dragging down my spine. She walked me backward, one step at a time, until the backs of my knees touched the couch. I sat without needing instruction. My legs parted slightly, automatically, as she sank to her knees in front of me. Her hands rested on my thighs, her thumbs stroking soft circles as her eyes locked onto mine. There was no room for shame, no space for refusal, just anticipation thick in the air like humidity before a storm. When she leaned forward and pressed her mouth to the inside of my thigh, I exhaled with a sound that wasn't quite a moan, but wasn't silence either. Her tongue traced the edge of the lace, teasing, avoiding, pulling me to the edge of frustration before her fingers slipped beneath the fabric and pulled it aside. Her mouth followed without hesitation, hot and slow and certain. My head dropped back and my hips lifted into her. My hands gripped the cushions like something was being taken from me and I didn't want it back. She moved expertly, her tongue deliberate and slow, knowing exactly where to pause, where to press, how to build without releasing. I lost track of time, lost track of breath. My thighs shook under her grip, my body bowed into her like a question mark, aching for punctuation. When the climax came, it wasn't a burst, it was a collapse, a total surrender. A soft, guttural sound escaped my throat, my back arched, and then I melted into the couch with a whimper that tasted like relief. She didn't give me time to recover. Her mouth left me only to trail kisses up my stomach, across my ribs, over my breasts. She unhooked my bra and slid it from my body like a memory she didn't want interrupted. I was open to her now, fully. She watched me as she climbed onto the couch, straddling my lap, one knee on each side of me. Her hand took mine and guided it between her thighs. She wasn't wearing anything beneath her trousers. Her skin was warm and slick, and when my fingers slipped inside her, she moaned directly into my neck, her breath wet against my skin. I moved inside her slowly at first, then faster, then deeper, learning her rhythm as she ground against my palm. She pulled my hair, not hard, but with meaning, tilting my head back so she could look down at me while I touched her. Her eyes were heavy, her lips parted, her body shuddering above me with every thrust of my hand. I felt powerful and powerless at once. She came hard, biting my shoulder to muffle the sound, her hips jerking against me in waves. I held her tightly as she trembled, her arms wrapped around my neck, her chest pressed to mine, our bodies slick with sweat and silence. She stayed on top of me for a long time, breathing heavily, face buried in the curve of my neck. I closed my eyes and just let it happen. Let the weight of her body press me deeper into the cushions. Let the moment stretch into something unspoken. Eventually, she moved. She stood, adjusted her blouse, smoothed her hair. I sat up slowly, my limbs heavy, my mind swimming in static. She walked to her desk without looking at me, pulled a piece of paper from a drawer, and laid it on the table. It was a receipt. I recognized the format. Itemized, neat. At the bottom, it read, Somatic Immersion Therapy, 90 minutes. The total was higher than before. She handed it to me without ceremony. I stared at the paper, my skin still tingling, my thighs damp, my heart trying to find its rhythm again. She stepped aside, opened the door, and waited. I stood, gathered my clothes without dressing, and walked out barefoot, the receipt clutched in one hand like an afterthought. Outside, the air felt wrong, thin, diluted. I walked to my car in a haze, not sure whether to cry or scream or laugh. I didn't do any of those things. I just sat in the driver's seat for a long time, still half naked, the imprint of her mouth fading on my thigh. It wasn't therapy anymore. It was something else, something deeper, something darker. And the worst part, the part I didn't dare speak aloud, was that I didn't want it to stop. I wanted more. I wanted everything, even if I had to pay for it, especially if I had to pay for it.